As all of these three traditional functions of banking can be performed in a single banking institution, just one single institution, in shadow banking, more than one single institution is necessary to perform these functions. Okay? So they have established, which I will explain in a minute, a lot of different institutions, and they build up relationships in production of those yield-bearing debt securities for the investors. Thus, banks establish some other financial institutions and vehicles that are not banks and use regulatory arbitrage and start performing those banking functions outside the regulators and supervisors' side. Now, the key word here is the regulatory arbitrage. That is to say, taking advantage of lightly regulated environment from heavily regulated environment. So banks were looking ways to escape from heavy regulation and supervision into either lightly regulated or non-regulated fields where they can take additional risks, because regulators limit their risk-taking behaviors and supervisors make sure that they are following those risk-limiting transactions. Therefore, these institutions are, or in fact some of these institutions are special purpose entities, structured investment vehicles, structure of collateralized debt obligations, asset-backed commercial papers, asset-backed securities, hedge funds, funds of funds, money market funds, government-sponsored financial institutions, and so forth. There are many institutions, they have established many institutions where they can operate banking, but not within the vision or the sight of the supervisors, usually outside of that side. And all of these are involved in securitization process. All these institutions and vehicles that are listed here, and there are many more, are used for securitization, where securitization can be defined in its simplest sense as taking an illiquid asset or group of assets and convert it into liquid securities via financial engineering. I don't know if you are familiar with this securitization concept. It's in fact very simple. When a bank lends out some money for mortgage for 30 years, that bank has to wait 30 years for collecting principal plus interest. Okay, 30 years is a very long time. And there are a lot of other investment opportunities in the markets. So instead of waiting 30 years, they just put those mortgages into a group and sell them to somebody else and collect principal plus some of the interest, not all, because the interest income will be delivered to those who buy those securities, and the banks will reinvest that newly incoming finance into more profitable credits so that they can still make more and more profits. Okay? More and more profits. This is the simplest definition of securitization. There are many different types of securitizations in the banking system, and some authors, when we look at the shadow banking issues, argue that there is a demand for shadow banking. So someone was demanding from the banks to operate in unregulated environments or lightly regulated environments, and therefore it can be called market-based banking. So they treat, or they define shadow banking as an industry which is heavily regulated and cannot perform well. Therefore, the demand in a free market mechanism created or provided a solution for more profitable institutions. Now, in order to understand this context, we need to understand the evolution of regulations. If you look back into the history, what we basically see about regulation is that governments regulate banks heavily when they start to fail. Okay? They put them on the right track for some time, and when they get sure that banks are on the right track, that they are no longer failing, they start to relax those regulations, which contributes into efficiency of the banking, therefore profitability. Okay? Thus, when banks are heavily regulated, their profitability and efficiency declines. When banks are lightly regulated, their efficiency and profitability improves. Okay? So there was probably, which I will discuss in a minute, an environment or a climate in which banks were facing profitability problems. So they were looking for ways of making more profit. That's what those authors mean when they say that there was a demand for shadow banking. Otherwise, banks should not involve in these shadow banking activities. So we can say that market produces a solution to a case in which there is a demand. What was the climate, or how was the climate during the evolution, or during how shadow banking evolved? There are two settings, as microeconomic settings and macroeconomic settings. In pre-2007-2009 crisis, if you look back 25, 30 years, we see some interesting characteristics. Like one, there was an increase in securitization processes. The amount of securitization have increased tremendously. This was done by financial engineering and technology. It was available for all the institutions. And then we have this business model of rating agencies. A lot of people, either institutional investors or individual investors, we all relied on the ratings of the companies, usually banks. We check to see if they have triple A's or double D and A or B plus. Even today, countries are measured with those ratings. Yes, but if a rating agency earns money from rating activities, how far can they evaluate their customers objectively? Do they really do that? Or do you guys believe that? That they can objectively, 100% objectively, they can evaluate the institution and earn their lives? Or do they sometimes, they engage in some dodgy games and they give triple A's although the bank deserves only triple B's, which makes that bank riskier than triple A, okay? Or less trustworthy than triple A. So there was this problem of, improved problem of business model for the rating agencies. The third one was about excessive use of leverage. Everyone, including individuals, were indebted. Everybody was kind of borrowing money from each other. Institutions from other institutions, individuals from institutions, so everybody was indebted. There was a high degree of leverage in the economies. And capital adequacy requirements were also relaxed. There was a method called VAR, value at risk, where this method was primarily used by banks to evaluate their own capital requirements. And this was required by the regulatory authorities. So regulatory authorities were simply asking banks to evaluate their own capital adequacy. How objective can they be while they are evaluating their capital adequacy? This is one perspective. The second perspective was that all those activities that takes place in the shadow banking are not part of VAR. That is to say, value at risk, which means they are not evaluated at all for the capital adequacy ratios. They were completely outside. And number 5 is socially inefficient intermediation was done. Number 6, failure of risk management systems within the banking institutions. And number 7, long-lasting deregulation process. And by this deregulation process, we mean getting capital markets closer to the banking institutions. From the Great Depression of 29-39, we have learned that capital market transactions should be totally separated from traditional banking. In other words, investment banking and commercial banking should be totally separated. But with the laws that were passed in mid-1930s or 1940s, they started deregulating it and then re-regulating it. And in 1970s, they started deregulating it again, which means relaxing those things allowing banks to make some risky investments, and as they don't fail, they keep making more and more investments, okay? And deregulation continued in that time period. Another problem, microeconomic problem, was the lack of transparency. Because of the asymmetric information, banks were not transparent. It was not really possible, even if you are an expert on financial statements or financial issues, you can still not observe what is happening in the bank when some of the activities are off balance sheet. We call these